It is a pleasure for me to contribute to the Foods PhD platform and the field school that is happening in Quebec City. I would have very much appreciated actually having had the opportunity to meet you in person, but instead, I hope that this recording will offer some insights into the topic that I will be sharing with you today related to food security and food policy. What I will attempt to do through this presentation is introduce some levers of change related to food safety and food security, identifying the importance of shaping a food regulatory policy that plays the role of an enabler, particularly to innovative solutions that are meant to address these challenges. Now, starting with a discussion about food systems, which I'm sure you have discussed over the last few days. Food systems today sit at the nexus of multiple interlocking challenges. First, we have to feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050. And this is happening even as climate change, as land degradation, as well as water scarcity continue to squeeze the agricultural productivity. The second challenge is related to the fact that we have a significant amount of food waste. About 1/3 of the food that we produce is lost or wasted, and this accounts between 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. We also have challenges associated with food safety, and based on the statistics that are advanced by the World Health Organization, we know that food safety considerations cause some 600 million illnesses per year and are responsible for about 420,000 deaths per year. And we know, in fact, that these deaths can be preventable. Now, we have developed over time a number of solutions, primarily through science, innovation, technologies, to address these challenges. However, in order for these solutions to be effective, these solutions must be able to access the markets. And we're going to be seeing some examples of what we need. So, for example, climate smart agronomy and precision breeding were designed to lift yields in a sustainable fashion. Now, these products resulting from changes in the way we produce agricultural products will need access to market, and that requires a regulatory decision. We know also that cultured meat, precision fermentation proteins contribute to optimize the use of land and the water use in particular, reducing, in fact, the requirements to rely on agricultural inputs and reducing also the need, for example, to have access to pesticides as well as veterinary applications. Again, for these applications to reach the market and to play the role, we need some regulatory decisions. Now, we have been also looking at impacts of traditional knowledge, and we have uncovered that many plants that grow in Africa are, in fact, climate resilient. And we have identified new sources of grains, potentially pulses. Of course, the discovery and the usability of insects, of fermentation cultures, all of these are sources that help diversify the diet, but also contribute to enhancing nutrition. Now, these applications, for the most part, and in most jurisdictions, including in Canada, would be considered as novel applications because in some instances, we do not have a safe history of use or safe history of consumption of these applications. And of course, we are also witnessing a number of developments related to processing technologies, such as smart cooling chains. We're looking at the reliance on pesticides on packaging material rather, that can keep food fresh for longer periods of time. And we're looking at the reduction of byproducts through the production processes in such a way that we limit the waste, particularly the wastage of energy. Now, a number of these applications also will require some approvals, and this has been the case particularly for the non-thermal pasteurization techniques, such as high pressure processing, which in Canada was subject to the novel food regulations until about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, these innovations, they can indeed transform food security and food safety. And we want to move from vulnerabilities to solutions that allow more resilience and more sustainability. In order to reach that, we need decisions that are made. We need regulatory policy decisions that enable access to market to all these applications. Now, science has been paramount, therefore, not only to invent new techniques, new technologies, new applications, and some of these solutions, but science is also paramount to guide the decision-making process such that these applications can get approved. And in fact, by grounding the setting of rules associated with these applications in a transparent, data-driven approach of risk assessment, by investing in the scientific capacity, particularly in the generation of data, by training regulators in modern methodologies, for example, exposure modeling, we can actually harness the power of science not only for innovation, but also to enable access to market and to enable the decision-making process that will be anchored in the scientific evaluations and therefore that will procure the predictability that is needed. And we're going to be looking at some illustrations of how we can shape a science-anchored food regulatory regime that will allow to address these challenges. So, in fact, what we want to witness is primarily to ensure that the food regulatory regimes, the food regulatory policies, are not seen as an impediment to access to market, but rather as an enabler. And ensuring that the scientific advances that I've just mentioned truly benefit society will, in fact, require us to invest in the development of this effective bridge between the discovery and the public use. And that's where food regulatory science and food regulatory policy become critically important. Now, again, enabling innovation and development basically is subject to the availability of the regulatory regime that will allow them to the market. What we want to witness is not to have brakes, but rather accelerators. And that's, again, what a well-designed, science-based food control system will help do. It will act as an enabler and as a guide for sustainable food innovation. Of course, this is even much better done when this is done in the context of an international process where there is recognition of the decision-making process. In fact, we know that science-based regulatory decisions tend to act as the mitigators of investor uncertainty. Why? Because basically by applying these regimes, you will be able to have a predictable environment. And if you apply this regime at the international level, with a system that allows you recognition of your decisions at the international level, you reduce the uncertainty even more because you will allow access to more markets. And this is facilitated when the decision-making process is happening under the auspices of the FAO WHO Codex Alimentarius Commission. This is an organization that was created and that convened its first meeting in 1963. And this is the organization that was tasked to develop what we call the food code. Codex Alimentarius is in fact Latin for food, which is alimentarius, code that is codex, but it is also the organization that is developing this food code. And in fact, Codex over the years, developed the rules, the foundations of how we can apply sound methodological approaches that are step-by-step approaches anchored in risk analysis and that guide the decision-making process, particularly for the approval of these applications. What Codex did is also provide a direction about how we should design and operate a food control system such that it acts as an enabler. And I'm going to share with you the output of a key Codex text that is known as CXG 82-2013. This Codex text actually provided the foundations about how we operate a food competent authority and how we can reach the best environment that will enable these sound decision-making processes. In fact, what Codex says is that we will require 13 principles to be fulfilled. The first principle is in fact the finality of the food control system. The finality of the food control system is to recognize that any food control system must be designed for the protection of consumers, but also with the second objective that is enabling fair practices in the food trade. A second principle speaks about the fact that any type of decisions that are made within the Codex system must be covering the whole food chain approach. We cannot have the supply chain not covered by particular controls. The third principle is that decisions must be transparent. The fourth decision is related to the fact that we need to operate in an environment where roles and responsibilities, particularly between competent authorities and between competent authorities and the production sector, need to be clearly identified and clearly articulated. When we know our responsibilities, we know how to assume them, and therefore we don't have as much failure. We limit the chances of failure. What this text also calls is that decisions need to be made in an environment that supports consistency and impartiality. We have also another recommendation, which is that decisions must be risk-based, science-based, and evidence-based. Now, what do I mean by risk-based? Risk-based means that when you have multitudes of options, you use risk as a way to prioritize your interventions. So, for example, when I have so many hazards that I need to manage, I will actually give the priority to the hazard that contribute to the highest risk. Also, what I mean by risk-based is that my decision must be commensurate with the risk. It means that I'm not going to be coming up with a hammer to kill a mosquito. That's always my analogy when we don't use a risk-based approach. So you have the tool to manage is not commensurate with the type of risk that you are managing. When we say science and evidence-based, it's because when we make those decisions, we need to conduct risk assessment, and that's essentially what the science-based environment is for, but also evidence-based. Evidence-based in what sense? Basically, this is because even the risk management articulation will be based on the analysis of the information, and that's what we call evidence. The following principle is about the fact that we should consider that competent authorities are not operating in silos. They need to cooperate, to coordinate. And that's particularly the case even within a national and a domestic market. When you have multiple players working, they need to be working together. They need to coordinate their interventions. Another obligation or another principle is that we need to develop a system where the decision-making process should be primarily focused to develop preventive measures. What does this mean? It means that I should not be basing my system by trying to chase end products, that I'm actually identifying certain hazards and I'm going to be taking foods from the market and I'm going to be chasing the end products in order to check whether or not there is a problem. Because when I do that, it's already too late. Basically, when the problem occurs, the food is already contaminated. And if I find it contaminated, I'm going to throw it away. So I am impacting food security. But if I apply a preventive control regime by imposing, for example, that HACCP, hazard analysis critical control points, or any other type of preventive controls like your supplier verification, to ensure that even my raw material fulfills the requirements of safety and quality, I am taking action at the beginning of the chain, and therefore I am limiting the chance to have the hazard being introduced into the food. Another principle is around the self-assessment and the review procedures. Basically, any food control system must be subject to review on a regular basis, and this can be done through a self-assessment protocol, through review procedures that need to be thought of even at the level of design of the system. We talked previously about cooperation and coordination. Here, we're talking about the possibility of recognizing other systems and the fact that when a decision is made in Europe or in the US, why don't we recognize it and use equivalent decisions as opposed to redoing the entire work? Um, Another principle is about the fact that I cannot design a food control system unless I have the legal foundation to do so. And this is a reminder that if you have rules, if your rules are not anchored in law, you will not be able to have teeth, and therefore you will not be able to have enforceable measures. Another principle calling for harmonization of decisions as much as possible, particularly within the context of the Codex Alimentaris Commission. And finally, that you cannot operate a food control system unless you have the right resources available to you. Now, this text is a Codex text. It was developed with the contribution of over 188 countries. It's actually 188 countries and one member organization that is the European Union. So, which means that actually to reach this, we needed to work together towards consensus. And that's why, while I would not agree with the order in which essentially the principles are listed, at the end of the day, I think these principles capture the real foundation for the best operation of a food control system. Now, what we also know is that we need also for the system to operate, we need to have uh, the appropriate planning. So essentially what we call the system design. So in this particular case, we design the system, we implement the system, we need to monitor the system. And then, of course, this tends to be inspired by a direction that is a policy that gives you the way forward. And this is a cyclical process that will allow your regime to function. Of course, this has to be also supported by continuous improvement of the system, and that's how a food control system tends to be designed. Now, I have developed another way of considering a readability of that CXG 82 2013, and that's related to how do we design effective food control programs. Now, I can actually summarize that text by saying effective food control programs need to be anchored in a system where you have a robust legislative regime, basically a robust legal system where you can draw your regulation. You need to make decisions in a consistent fashion and a methodological fashion. And that's how your risk analysis paradigm based on risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication will offer. And this is the output of your food control system. So based on risk analysis, and you need to put all this together thanks to a robust governance. The governance is really about the way the decisions are made, how the collaboration is organized, and basically how you codify who approves what, who decides what. That's really the governance system. This must be supported by robust and functioning institutions, but also, given that most of the decisions are anchored in science, as we said, you need to have a strong scientific capacities in all those regulatory organizations. So this is essentially another way to paraphrase the 13 principles of CXG 82 2013. Now, I would like to insist on a couple of notions that were mentioned in the principles, and one of them is related to the need to make sure that you have an oversight over the entire supply chain. Now, in some countries, you may not necessarily find one regulator that is responsible for everything, and you may have the responsibilities shared between various regulatory agencies. What matters is that you do not have gaps. So, for example, if you have a regulator that is focusing on primary production and another one on processed foods, you need to make sure that you have a collaboration and coordination such that the rules that are set here are enabling the rules that are set here, and vice versa. The rules that are set for the final products, they cannot be rules that would have no way to be achieved as part of the primary production. So you need to basically interlink your decision-making processes, and you need to have a collaboration. Another type of collaboration. Now, we think essentially that the way the systems work is that we have rules that are set and the industry applies the rules. In fact, this is a little bit more complex than that. In order to have a successful and effective food control system, you need to have really a complete exchange between the two, meaning that in most of the instances, and what works the best is that when industry throughout the entire supply chain develops methods of controls of the hazards, methods of controls of the quality, methods of production that will ensure hygiene, that will ensure the good quality. And in fact, these methods tend to become the inspiration for the development of the rules, because now we have rules that we know are achievable. And at the end of the day, the approaches that were developed, what we are trying to do is to level the playing field by promulgating them not as voluntary approaches, but as compulsory system. Another aspect that I would like to share with you in relation with the way decision making is made is how do you decide which products you will be subjecting to what I call a pre-market oversight, meaning that before the product accesses the market, you need to review it and approve it, versus what is managed through post-market oversight. And here I need to draw an important remark, and that is that the majority of food is managed through post-market management. What do we mean by that? We mean that the products that we have are governed by general rules, and so long that these general rules are fulfilled, the product can access the market, whether be it maximum levels for contaminants, whether be it the composition in nutrients, whether be it the microbiological criteria, the labeling provisions, the nutrition labeling, and so on. So these are primarily rules that are to be applied in a post-market fashion, meaning that as long as the product is meant to fulfill these rules, it can access the market and it doesn't ask for authorization. Now, when the risk increases or the perception of the risk increases, you may want to have a higher scrutiny, a higher oversight, meaning that you're going to be making the system of the management of foods getting closer to the management of therapeutic products or health products. You're going to be asking that the foods gets reviewed, or the food ingredient, so it could be novel foods, for example, GMOs, it could be um, even actually a novel crop or a novel process. You need to have a dossier that justifies the safety of the application. And on the basis of that, you have a decision of access to market or not. That's what we call pre-market oversight. And what determines that should be the level of risk. So, for example, in North America, in Canada, in the United States, we consider that infant formula is a product that is destined to the most vulnerable population, which is infants, but also is meant potentially to be consumed as a sole source food. As a result, I think we have a good reason to subject the product to pre-market oversight. Another element that we need to think about as regulators is that to make sure that the food control system, and that's even another way to paraphrase CXG 82 2013, a system must be set to encompass the various regulatory functions. You need to set rules on products. You need to set rules on establishment that are meant really to um, uh, produce these particular foods. And these rules that are related to the functioning of establishments should cover both domestic establishments as well as uh, for example, imports. So essentially an importer, point of entry, and the way the importer manages their supply chain. After you have rules, you need to ensure that these rules are complied with, and that's why you need to have a compliance verification regime. Generally, that's your inspection system. And finally, when you do inspection and when you do compliance verification, you are bound to find non-compliances, and therefore you need to have an incident management regime. All this needs to be enabled by science capacity, by human resources, by horizontal policy requirements, by an operational planning, and by the appropriate resourcing. I will say a few words about the importance of having a system, a food control system that is anchored in a robust legislation. Basically, a food legislation, is generally the mechanism that allows to specify the roles and responsibilities. It is a system that also from which we draw what we call the regulation making authorities. So that's why in order to modernize a food control system, we generally start by looking at modernizing the legislation to make sure that you have the powers that you need, the powers to enforce, the powers to promulgate rules. To give you an example, the US Food and Drug Administration, which is one of the key regulators in the United States, did not have a recall power until 2011. Whereas thankfully in Canada, and since the creation of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in 1997, Section 19 of the Act, of the CFIA Act, gives the minister the power to recall food. Here, I am re-insisting on the importance of having a sound regime of rulemaking and to be able to determine what are the conditions under which I will be assessing products on a pre-market basis versus post-market basis. And of course, the rulemaking does not apply only to foods, but also to establishments. And generally, this rulemaking should be imposing minimum conditions that need to be fulfilled for an establishment to be open and to produce food. These are made out of what we call the prerequisite programs. The prerequisite programs are all the requirements that are needed in order to make sure that before I start production, everything is set in order to minimize hazards and risks. So, for example, the education of your workers, the hygiene of your workers, the control of your primary ingredients, that's all part of the prerequisite programs. Now, when you start producing, you need to make sure that your production cycle was made in such a way that you identified the potential introduction of hazards and therefore risks, and actually that you develop the appropriate mitigation strategies. And finally, as part of the management of the establishment, you need to set traceability rules. Traceability backwards, that's actually taken care of by the prerequisite programs because that's the control of your suppliers. But traceability forward is something that is fundamental because it allows you primarily to identify any potential as early as possible any potential whereabout of a contaminated ingredient. When it is contaminated, you want to recall it very quickly, and having the right traceability will allow you to do that. Here, I'm insisting on the importance of the collaborative approach, whereby the rules that are developed must be inspired by the capacity of the sector to implement. And also, I am insisting on the fact that this collaboration needs to be anchored and supported in what we call a compliance promotion regime. When you develop the requirements and you develop any new protocols or procedures that need to be fulfilled, you need to wait a moment to ensure that the regulated parties, meaning the industry, has all the tools and the capacity and the competency to be able to apply those new rules. So that's why, one of the indicators of success, in fact, of a good food control system is that you have a collaborative regime. So when I consider that a food control system is successful, it is successful when your sector is compliant on a voluntary basis. You don't need to promulgate that many rules, and you don't even need to enforce. But that's utopia, okay? I mean, utopia is when I don't need any rules and I don't need to enforce anything because everybody understands the rules and everybody will do the right thing. Now, of course, I mean, while I know that that's not possible in the absolute, I should try to reach it. Now, I know that in order also to give success or to put success in my side, I need to have most of my interventions to be preventive interventions, and I need to have as much collaboration as possible. When parties operate in a collaborative approach, you end up with a more predictable system, particularly when it is anchored in science, and also on a risk-based system. So even if you don't have a lot of resources, you try to devote your resources to the areas that matter the most. Saying a few words about the importance of a compliance and enforcement policy, this is the system that specifies to the stakeholders what are the rules and the principles that you're going to follow in your enforcement. So an enforcement policy is a document that describes the principles of your interventions. How do I move from the steps of promulgating a rule to starting to enforce it, and also offers any resources and guidance to the regulated parties? Primarily, an enforcement policy needs to be based on what we call the VAID system. The VAID system is a system where you design your actions in an incremental way. When you design a new rule, you try to educate about the rule. You try to promote the information about this new rule. And that's what we call a voluntary compliance, education, engagement, communication. And then you monitor and you see if there are any issues. And when you identify issues, you do what we call an assisted compliance. You may have identified that there are some resources that are missing, some guidances that are missing, and you develop these guidances and you make them available. That's what we call the assisted compliance. Now, after a while, you may identify that, well, still some are not complying. Now, going to be taking a firmer approach. You're going to be having what we call a directed compliance by ensuring that you have, for example, a letter putting all the corrective controls, the corrective actions that need to be made, and as a result, basically sending it and asking for these actions to be fulfilled immediately. And finally, after doing all that, when you still find non-compliances, you need to fully apply the law. Now, part of the illustrations of what we call a collaborative regime is a system of co-regulation. This is something that I took from Dr. Martinez's paper in 2007. Co-regulation is a system between self-regulation, where the industry sets the rules and follows them and applies them on its own, and a fully enforceable system where basically the system is set on the basis that you have rules set by the regulators and enforcement that is made by the regulator, and where the regulated parties will only apply. Co-regulation, you develop the rules together. You may even give the industry a stronger role by the fact that you give them the principles of the development of the rules and you let them do the rules themselves in details, but then you can validate the way the rules are being potentially useful and fulfilling to your objectives. And of course, let's not forget that we need to always minimize the cost and have more efficiency. And that's where science, for example, help us to do that, primarily now with artificial intelligence amongst the solutions that we can find to reduce the costs, but also by applying a risk-based approach and by also applying new technologies such as data-driven traceability, which helps you to pinpoint the elements that you need to recall with more consistency. Now, here I will say that for any food control system, you are as weak as your weakest link. When you have a very good industry that develops the right tools, that applies them, and so on, you will not be successful unless you have a good regulator. Because having a good regulator that is trusted is what markets will require in order to accept your product. So we need to invest in a food regulatory capacity. And here I am advocating for centers of excellence in food regulatory science around the world, because unfortunately, despite our goodwill, you cannot have the same size of regulatory capacity, the one that we have in Canada, in the US, or in Europe, in every country of the world. So you need to have collaboration, and collaboration can happen at the regional level. And of course, you need to be animated by the same objectives, which is essentially to succeed in your work. You need to have a regulator that develops the rules in a manner that is collaborative, that applies prevention and science as a guide. You need to have informed consumers, you need to have compliant industry, and you have to have a vibrant scientific community that is engaged in this entire process. And finally, I will finish by saying when you have a robust food regulatory regime, that's how you can enable all those resources that will allow you to find the solutions, to have more sustainability, to have more resilience, and aiming, therefore, for more food security. Harnessing the contributions of a sound food control system is essential to building food systems that are resilient, sustainable, and supported by a trusted and enabling food regulatory regime. With that, I'm very thankful to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to be part of this course, and I look forward to your comments and the outputs of your discussions. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the course.